Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Milano, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this evening's lecture with Dr. Keith Waylon, coordinated by the Heberden Society of Weill Cornell Medicine. I have a few announcements to make before Dr. Waylon's lecture begins. Now, if you're a member of the tri-institutional community, you may be interested in participating in the book club for Push and Cool by Dr. Keith Waylon to be held tomorrow, April 28th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The book club will explore some of the themes presented in today's lecture with a discussion co-facilitated by Dr. Erica Phillips and Dr. David Scales. The registration link is available through the Weill Cornell Medicine events calendar and the Weill Cornell Medicine Diversity Week webpage. Now, for those who are interested in the history of the Newark Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, I would invite you to explore the website for our very own Medical Center archives. The archives includes historical materials dating all the way back to 1771, including this patent medicine trade card advertising Cushman's menthol inhaler. Thousands of photographs and documents are digitized and available for reference through the link seen here. Now, the website also includes From Snake Oil to Social Media, Drug Advertising and Your Health, an asynchronous workshop about the enduring issues in medication regulation and safety and the ongoing importance of advertising and pharmaceutical literacy. This online resource contains digitized 19th and early 20th century medical trade cards, including Cushman's menthol inhalers seen on the previous slide. Now, I'll share all the links I mentioned today in the webinar chat. We invite participation in our question and answer session following today's talk. You'll find a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can enter questions, and we'll get to as many as possible following tonight's lecture. Now, on that note, I'll pass the virtual microphone over to Dr. Jessica Pena, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Radiology and the Assistant Dean for Admissions at Weill Cornell Medicine, who will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, it's really my pleasure and an honor to introduce Dr. Keith Waylon. Dr. Wailoo is Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, where he teaches in the Department of History and the School of Public and International Affairs. He is the former chair of the Department of History, the former vice dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, and the immediate past president of the American Association for the History of Medicine. He's an award-winning author on drugs and drug policy, race, science and health, genetics and society. He's received numerous awards, including the Dan David Prize in 2021 for his, quote, influential body of historical scholarship focused on race, science, and health equity, on the social implications of medical innovation, and on the politics of disease. He has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and National Academy of Medicine, among other honors. It's really an honor to have you here today, Dr. Wailoo, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much for both the introduction and the invitation to talk about this book today. Let me just share my screen and hide the video panel. I'm sorry, hide the. There we go. Sorry. So I'm assuming everyone can see what the title screen is. And what I thought I would do today for this talk is just to give you an overview of an issue that is actually far more current than even we might have guessed. That is, about a month ago, the Food and Drug Administration submitted a proposed rule on how it expected to proceed on the proposed ban of menthol cigarettes to the Office of Management and Budget. And when this rule was submitted to OMB, many anticipated that this was a sign that the agency was ready to move ahead with this proposed ban. Now, an OMB economic assessment is always a necessary step before whenever an executive branch agency is proposing a policy with economic or fiscal ramifications. And the FDA has long been promising a ruling by the end of April, that is this month. And since we are about to see the end of April in the next 2 days, many of us expect, and it's been widely discussed, that either tomorrow or on Friday, the FDA will have a press conference in which it announces what many of us expect to be a ban on menthol cigarettes. So this talk is incredibly timely. a month ago, when the FDA submitted its proposed rules to OMB, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, which is one of the many groups that has been lobbying and advocating aggressively for this step, so applauded it as standing up finally to the tobacco industry and proposing a bold life-saving policy that will protect kids from tobacco addiction, advance health equity, and save lives, especially among Black Americans, seeing the cigarette, and particularly the menthol cigarette, as a major cause of health disparities. One of the questions that we might ask, and forgive the typo in the very first word there, is how did we get to this particular moment? Well, this moment, you might say there's the long history of the menthol cigarette, and then there is a somewhat shortened history of the proposed ban. Because the menthol cigarette was almost banned in 2009. And to understand the regulatory moment that we're in today, as in this week, we need to go back to 2009 and to look at the politics of race, Congress, and why it is that when President Obama, pictured here, signed path-breaking legislation, the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, in 2009, which gave the FDA, not only did it do something revolutionary, it gave the FDA jurisdiction and authority over tobacco products, something that had been denied the FDA for the entire history of the cigarette. But it also did something sweeping in banning all flavored cigarettes as seen as illegitimate enticements, especially to young smokers, in luring them into the smoking habit with intensification, the use of flavoring. But the irony of this moment is that the menthol flavored cigarettes were excluded from the ban. And in this legislation, the Food and Drug Administration was handed authority to make the final determination, not Congress. Congress didn't want to act, but it handed the responsibility to the FDA. And the reason why this happened is a New York story, in part. It's also a story of, as the New York Times highlighted, the Black representatives of Congress splitting over the question of menthol cigarettes. In this article from 2008, the New York Times reported that there was a rift that had opened in the 43-member Black caucus over a menthol provision in the legislation that would enable FDA to regulate tobacco. And on the side in favor of, well, opposed to a menthol ban was the then Brooklyn representative Edolphus Towns, who was often regarded as Congress's Marlboro Man because of the large donations and campaign donations that he received from the tobacco industry. In fact, one of the ways in which the tobacco industry ensured that the menthols would not be banned in that legislation, but it would be moved over to FDA, is by really winning strong supporters, adherents among Black representatives. And because Henry Waxman, the architect in many ways of this legislation, was unwilling to risk the bill's passage by making changes in the menthol language, the decision was punted to FDA, where it has remained to this day, to this week. And that is why we are in this particular moment. Now, there are particular moves that the FDA sought to make in 2010-11 to ban the menthol cigarettes and were challenged in court. 2018, the FDA commissioner under the Trump administration, Scott Gottlieb, announced a ban, but then he left office shortly thereafter. So this is easily perhaps the third time around. What I'd like to do today, in the time that I have, is to give you a long history of the menthol cigarette and how it is that we arrived at this point. Because as what Nicole Milano suggested in showing those menthol inhaler images, menthol didn't start only as an additive to cigarettes. And mentholated cigarettes came into the market with a promise very much like those menthol inhalers, a promise of health. A false promise, because menthol cigarettes, as I'll describe in a second, were first marketed in the 1920s through the 1940s, not with a racial market as the point of focus, but marketed for its anesthetic value, particularly for smokers who in their regular brand choice were experiencing what was called smoker's throat and needed a relief. And the mentholated cigarette promised that temporary relief before you went back to your regular brand. It's in the 1950s that menthol smoking sees a significant uptick in the context of increasing studies that link smoking to cancer and then later heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And in some ways, what you see the industry doing is recognizing, building on this long false idea that mentholated smoking was health producing or health protecting. And so in the context of what the industry calls the cancer scares, you begin to see increasing studies of smoker psychology, health beliefs, helping to build menthol as a market product, but a steady source of smoking, wrapped in this veneer of being therapeutic. It's in the 1960s that there is a strong and aggressive pivot towards racialized marketing of menthol brands by the leading companies that produce menthol cigarettes. And you begin to see a study of Black culture, what one company called poverty markets, and also the study of the way in which African-American economic and social trends created a basis for the building of urban markets. It's also in this time period that you see what I argue is a strong strain of kind of predatory capitalism that's driving the shift of menthol marketing to cities. And then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you begin to see the intensification of this, especially in the wake of the ban of on television and radio ads. Companies begin to wonder, well, if television is beyond our reach because it's been banned by tobacco ads on television have been banned, then how do we redouble our efforts and focus our advertising? And you see in this context the rise of the urban billboard as a dominant feature of targeted marketing in this era. And it's this long history that I hope to tell you about in leading up to why it is that there is in the 90s a pivot towards community resistance against these trends and in enlarged critique in public health that has brought us to this particular point, at which you see that menthols are understood as a product that is targeted at African Americans, that has produced ill health in Black communities. And this new understanding has led to increasing movement towards banning menthol products, menthol cigarettes in city states and the federal government. So, quick overview. The menthol cigarette, as I said, began with rather dubious health claims, deceptively promising temporary relief from smoker's throat. And you see this graphically in the ads that were in major media in the Chicago Tribune, promising, asking the smoker, do you have smoker's throat? Well, if so, turn to Kool, switch to Kool cigarettes to avoid this smoker's throat feeling. So just like the menthol inhaler was advertised as a therapeutic product, so too was the menthol cigarette. Or this ad for Kools in 1952, featuring both of them, Willie the Penguin, the mascot for Kool cigarettes. When April showers make you cough like crazy, refreshing Kools taste fresh as a daisy. Got a cough? Switch from hots to Kools. I mean, it's not that the therapeutic messages were implicit. The therapeutic message was explicit. That is to say, the notion that if you smoke mentholated cigarettes, you will experience this phenomenon that we all know because of the fact that we often use mentholated toothpaste or eat products or chewing gum with menthol in it, that distinctive cool feeling that pervades the nostrils, the throat, and the mouth. Now, we know that the temperature of the nose and the throat and the mouth does not change with the use of menthol. Menthol was understood to be a perversion of the senses, but the companies understood that, there was actually no cooling. There is no opening of the airways when you use menthol. Menthols do not have therapeutic value, but they do convey the belief in the user that something is happening in the body, that the airways are opening. And as a result, the menthol market really inhabited this therapeutic space for a wide range of products, including cools, as pictured here. Now, what allows me to tell the story of how the menthol product emerged and grew over time is the fact that in 1998, the departments of justice and the attorneys generals across the country sued the tobacco industry for the history of deceptive marketing. And as a result of the settlement in the Master Settlement Agreement in 1998, millions and millions of documents that document and describe the different advertising habits and the ways in which polling, interviews, and markets were created allows us to look behind the curtain of the industry to understand the way in which the way in which different kinds of devices created markets. And what I document in my book is the role of social scientists, particularly social psychologists, in understanding how health anxiety could become the basis of building the menthol market. And so these companies, the Psychological Corporation, pollsters like Lewis Harris, and a company like the Institute for Motivational Research, which you'll hear about in a bit, studied people's health beliefs, studied identity, masculinity, femininity. They studied status anxiety, they studied race, and they studied perception, and they were engaging in a persuasion effort at an intricate level that really can make your head spin it when you document all of the details of it. As I said, the 1950s became a pivotal moment in how the menthol market grew. And the industry became quite alert to the fact that in the context of what one industry analyst, Harry Wooten, called the cancer scare, the so-called cancer scare was a psychological phenomenon. It's a psychological factor that no one can evaluate accurately, he wrote, but it is doing one thing. It's changing the type rather than the volume of smoking. It's in the context of cancer worries that smokers began to turn towards filtered cigarettes and menthol cigarettes. And the industry became alert to the fact that as smoking habits were changing, what smokers were looking for was the illusion of safety. And therein you see the increasing role of social psychology, individuals like Ernest Dichter, the founder of an institute for motivational research, that worked very, very intensively with the industry to study health motivation, style motivation, aesthetic motivation, and how these psychological qualities underpinned brand choice. And it's also in the 1950s that such scientists understood and told the industry that the menthol brands were growing specifically for people who were genuinely anxious about their health. So writing in the 1950s, no researchers would have thought of the menthol appeal as a racial appeal at all. For any tobacco executive, the menthol appeal was a health appeal. It was connected with health anxiety, with class, with health concerns. And many argued, as did one research group, the Market Planning Corporation, which conducted extensive interviews with individuals, that you had to understand class and health worries to understand the rise of popularity of a new menthol product, Salem. Kool had been created in the 1930s. There was an earlier brand called Spud in the 1920s. But Salem hit the market in the mid-1950s and suddenly started growing dramatically. And as this study highlighted, Salem as a cigarette is a little more for upper income bracket people. Kools, on the contrary, are seen very clearly as lower income cigarettes, a feeling that Kool is smoked by older and retired people, largely because it was an older brand of cigarette. And this study also documented the central role of health. Kool and Salem smokers, said the study, are acutely conscious of their health. The personality tests show that the menthol smokers' concern about their health is based on deeper lying aspects of their personalities, much more so than they're much more aware of their health than the average person. And here is how the menthol choice was understood in psychological terms. These were people who could neither give up smoking easily nor smoke without feeling some threat, and therefore they were looking for a compromise. Menthol, said the psychologist, was an evasion. Many of these smokers try to evade the issue raised by cancer research. In some, the Salem smoker faces a dilemma. He wants a great deal from his cigarette, and he is not prepared to give up some qualities. So by looking behind the curtain, one might say, of industry and those consultants who helped build markets, what this book allows us to see is what the journalist Vance Packard called the hidden persuaders. In fact, Ernest Dichter figures prominently in Packard's 1957 book, The Hidden Persuaders. But there are many others: economists, sociologists, psychologists, urban studies scholars, social scientists of a wide range that were very influential in creating markets. The book is also the story of competition between these companies vying for one another. Kool seeking to encroach on Salem's market, Salem looking to encroach on Kool's market, and newcomers like Newport trying to build their own, and Philip Morris, a company that was, had this kind of blockbuster brand called Marlboro, but was never quite successful at building a menthol brand. It's also the story about how markets are made in perhaps unintended ways, that at the same time that the television ads are being banned, you see the rise of this new intensive form of billboard public transit advertising in inner cities that helps to build and sustain and, you might say, and nurture urban markets. So it's a story of behavioral research within the industry that builds markets. And perhaps surprisingly, it's also the story of how the tobacco insiders conducted a kind of Black studies program long before Black studies was even an academic field of research. That is to say, to look at the studies that were documenting taste and brand trends is to also see intimate studies of the history of African-American urban life, studies of gender, studies of the urban commercial context that ended up being of interest, not in an academic sense, but purely in the sense of building brand preferences. So for instance, I'll give you just one example of how Ernest Dichter would write about new potentials for cigarettes in the early 1960s. In a report, Motivations on Cigarette Smoking, he would talk about the youth market. And in some ways, the youth market was seen as the growth market for menthols in the early 1960s. He would talk about the older market as well. And then he would talk about what he called the status-seeking market. And he noted, for instance, that in this country, the Negro market in particular has been a fruitful outlet for many status products. The natural desire to achieve equality in every way possible in a segregated society still has prompted the Negro consumer to the extensive purchase of all those products which are seen as being indicative of a raised socioeconomic and cultural level. Filtered cigarettes, he argued, represented such a product. Even as early as late as 1961, the linkage between menthol smoking and race was not clearly developed for these tobacco insiders. No, the menthol market in 1960-61 was decidedly a youth market. College newspaper advertising was the primary means of advertising in the early 1960s. Here you see just a document on college newspaper advertising trends and the desire of the makers of Salem to increase their marketing at a number of universities, including Yale, my own university, Princeton University, and their Cornell University in Ithaca as well. The college market was the target for advertisements in newspapers. College campuses was the locus of couponing. Students were hired as sales representatives. Free samples were distributed in general. And to look at to cool advertising in the early 1960s was to see this image of youthful, refreshing, snow-fresh brands that were at the center of tobacco and menthol advertising. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, there was increasing unease, especially given the cancer concerns, that the cigarette was engaged in the luring of youth, the deceptive luring of youth into long-term habits. And faced with the threat of congressional action, which seemed imminent in the late 50s and especially in the early 1960s, the industry chose to withdraw from college advertising because if they hadn't, there would be legislation demanding such. So by 1963, college newspapers were cut off from advertising, and the industry was in search of new outlets and new markets. And this is where the pivot to intensive Black advertising in urban markets emerge. So this is a chart that shows up in the book that shows you how in 1953, menthols were a minuscule portion of the tobacco market. About 2 or 3% of brands smoked were mentholated brands, but that begins to shift dramatically in the context of what was called the cancer scares, and it is Salem that rises rapidly in the 1950s, followed by Kool. And by 1964, there is what the industry calls the second cancer scare, when the Surgeon General's report comes out, linking cancer even more definitively, cigarettes even more definitively to cancer. And so the story you see that plays out in the 60s is one in which Kool branding is in ascent, Salem has risen, and there's a tension between Salem being understood as a more suburban and female cigarette, and Kool's rise being associated with urban Black and male consumers. So with increasing public critique of youth-oriented marketing, you see the intensive use of focus groups, psychographic studies, street corner interviews to understand social status anxiety, to understand poverty markets, understand urban health worries and gender concerns as the basis of building markets. This is an image that's on the cover of the book. It's actually Bronzeville, the Black section of Chicago in the mid-1960s, and that's the New York Yankees catcher, Elston Howard, who became a spokesperson advertising Kool, come all the way up to the menthol magic of Kool, or this image from the mid-1970s, which shows a much more opinionated kind of smoker of Kool. I want to give you a sense of the way in which markets were created in this context by turning to one document. And that document is a Madison Avenue proposal to the makers of Camel in November of 1967. It's a proposal that's written by the company Dancer Fitzgerald and Sample relating to Camel menthols and the Negro market in Black St. Louis. And it's a particularly secretive kind of strain of racial capitalism that I characterize as predatory, and you'll see exactly why I say so. The document begins, this is to summarize our thoughts on a way to reach the Negro market for Camel menthol, and specifically what we're doing now in the Negro area of St. Louis. The important thing in the 1960s was to tap into generational tensions, that Negroes, as the document says, don't want what daddy used to smoke or drink, that's old-fashioned or low class. The importance in the 60s of appealing to Black pride and rejecting white standards. The Negroes no longer look to the white market, said the document, and its purchasing norms and habits to set the pace in what to buy. Again, Negroes are becoming increasingly proud of the fact that they are Negroes, and they are now rejecting many of the standards or patterns set by the white community, the study of Black social psychology. The important strategy articulated in this document is how to find centers of influence in Black St. Louis. In both working and social situations, says the document, Negroes tend to gravitate to groups, and Negro men usually spend more time with their respective groups than the average white man, whether it be in bars, club meetings, on the street, or at their jobs. Within these groups, there are, quote, centers of influence underlined, individuals who lead the others because they are more in the know or they are more forceful. These are not leaders in the sense of being president of the PTA or a local civic organization, but might well be a barber, a numbers man, a bellhop, a bartender, or a taxi driver who likes to show how smart he is with his pals and associates. They are established kingfish. These, said the document, are the best news spreading system. They have a strong desire for status and class, and it was useful for us, and the strategy here was to deliver to them boast materials. They're characterized as cell groups. We must impart prestige and factual knowledge in a personalized, almost secret manner, in addition to the product itself. And we must aim this promotional effort at the leaders and communicators within the Negro cell groups. The additional information given to these selected individuals is called boast material, in that it allows them to be, quote, in the know, unquote, and brag to friends about the inside information on a particular brand. So this is the deceptive way in which influence is created, by identifying centers of influence, kingfish in communities, handing them boast material so that a pattern of use could be established. The industry studies communities at an intimate level. It's not just kind of, broad brush targeted marketing. They understand the nuances of influence making in one city versus another. They study how race works, how local racism can actually be an impediment to advertising, and they study how all of these attitudes, as they are changing, should guide advertising imagery. They're alert to racial attitudes, for instance, as negative views among young whites about Black imagery in cool ads define certain communities. They become aware of the need to avoid or to navigate those concerns. So in the 1970s, as they see a shift from young whites in places like Chicago moving from wanting to emulate Black fashion and Black culture to young white smokers being, quote, alienated from Blacks in the context of increasing concerns about busing or racial equality, or the quest for racial equality, they begin to track these attitudes. And a marketing plan in 1976 Chicago points out that these feelings of racism, particularly anti-Black racism, are more widespread among Chicago white people than in the country generally. Anti-Black feelings are also expressed in their dislike for integrated ads. So where you put what kinds of ads up, related intimately to the industry's study of local racism. Targeting took many different forms, especially after the national radio and television ban on advertising, and intensified in its focus with billboards, with posters, with public transit, with point of sale outreach, and the free sampling intensifying. And the study really also focused on things like the use of public transit. Here's a document that I found kind of fascinating in the 1980s that highlights how the makers of Newport, Lorillard, were intensely concerned with ridership on very specific bus lines and the neighborhoods through which those buses traveled. As this document noted, and differences from one city to the next. As this document noted, in making determinations about advertising on bus lines in Boston, I do not recommend using Black creative, that is to say, Black themed ads, because these buses service white areas too. Of the three lines, 60%, 30%, 20% respectively of these services areas are Black. Conversely, the balance of the viewers are white. In this case, the spill is too sizable for my liking. You might question why 60% was acceptable portion for me to recommend using Black creative in DC while not in Boston. Well, this is because in the South, menthol usage is extremely Black. In Boston, we run the risk of alienating our white franchise, white potential users. But in Pittsburgh, another document highlighted that when African Americans traveled on a bus system from Black enclaves through white neighborhoods, it was appropriate to advertise Black themed ads on the inside of the bus, but not on the exterior of the bus. This gives you a sense of the intimate way in which these companies were trying to both cultivate and reach markets while also limiting what they consider to be the downsides. Now, it's important to understand that the industry did not do this alone. They did this with a wide range of supporters. In fact, markets are created by advertising, but they are sustained with a wide range of helpers. And one of those were the Black publishers. People like John H. Johnson, the publisher of Ebony magazine, who in the context of a segregated society explained and echoed some of the same sentiments that Ernest Dichter did. That patronizing a first-class eating establishment in a comfortable manner is not always easy for Black folks in the context of a segregated society. Outlays of money for country clubs and resorts and similar recreation in most instances is out of the question. Therefore, Negro Americans, he wrote, are forced outside the mainstream of American life in so many ways, and they achieve compensatory gratification in ways that often are quite surprising to the rest of America. In some cases, they overconsume, in others, they underconsume as compared to whites. And magazines like Ebony were one of the prominent places in which you begin to see Black-themed, cool, Montclair, Salem, and other advertisements in the 1960s. Really, magazines that depend heavily on the revenue from the industry. I'll skip past because I want to make sure there's time for a conversation, but I'm interested in not just how markets are created over time, how they're nurtured, and how industry navigates the complexities of race, but also the rise of local activism, because after all, as the billboard jungles of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s grow, there's a disparity in advertising that becomes quite vivid and discernible. Suburban ads, suburban billboards, few and far between. Urban ads, really densely, and this is actually densely populated, densely part of the urban landscape. And this is where I came into the story as a young child. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, and I begin the book by talking about what it was like to grow up surrounded by these advertisements. But those advertisements would become a source of much debate and consternation, especially among local activists. And so in the 1980s, late 1980s, I picture here one of the favorite characters in the book, a man named Henry McNeil Brown, who went by the name Mandrake. And one of his pastimes in Chicago was whitewashing or blackwashing billboards for alcohol and tobacco, engaging in vandalism, engaging in vigilante behavior in opposition to these trends. Community activists and public health advocates also began taking aim and critiquing the urban billboard in this time period. The industry, of course, decried these as violations of its right to free speech. And what's remarkable is how the industry was able to win unlikely supporters in this time period. Unlikely supporters from within the Black community, politicians like Adolphus Towns later on, but also those who were heavily financially supported by the industry, who could also argue on the industry's behalf. And this is what leads up to a really momentous shift in the book, the story of the Uptown controversy that pitted the reformers against those who would defend the industry's right to advertise. It's a turning point in the history of the menthol market. Menthol marketing exposed a lot of the industry tactics, its hidden supporters, and it also energized the critics. And it features an unlikely opponent and unlikely supporters. I'll turn to that in a second. And it laid, in some ways, the groundwork for the ban on billboards that would come as a result of that master settlement in 1998. As I said, the Uptown controversy was a dramatic shift in the politics of Black health. and tobacco wealth. R.J. Reynolds announced in late 1989 that it was coming out with a new mentholated brand called Uptown, that it would only market in Black Philadelphia. And they proudly pitched this as an exclusively Black cigarette intended for Black smokers. At that point, the Secretary for Health and Human Services was Louis Sullivan, a physician, a Black physician, a founding dean of Morehouse College, Morehouse, and a Republican appointee in a business-friendly administration under the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. But Louis Sullivan came out aggressively. It tells you a great deal about how the medical world and the public health world had come to understand cigarettes as a detriment to public health in general and a devastating presence in Black communities. And Louis Sullivan came out and announced that Uptown's campaign was slick and sinister. It was spreading a culture of cancer, and its message is more disease, more suffering, and more death for a group already bearing more than its share of smoking-related illness and mortality. But the makers of Uptown also had an unlikely supporter in Benjamin Hooks, the executive director of the NAACP, which in the 1980s had actually inked a contract, a kind of a partnership with Brown and Williamson and others to try to build economic livelihood in cities and also infuse the ailing civil rights organization with much needed financial support. And because of that, Benjamin Hooks came out in support of the industry and argued that the arguments against billboards was the anti-billboard argument was itself racist because it suggested that Black people could not make up their own mind. That, as he wrote, buried in this line of thinking is the rationale that Blacks are not capable of making their own free choices. His comments reflect, as this article in Newsweek says, the reluctance of some Black groups to attack tobacco companies which have donated money to support events and causes ranging from jazz festivals to the United Negro College Fund. So it's this tension that manifested itself in 2009 still, when the menthol ban came up for discussion in Congress. The industry still had its supporters. Now, what's interesting about, let me just go back for a second. What's interesting about this debate is that the Uptown debate exposed the tactics that companies used in winning Black supporters. In fact, RGR could not compete with the bully pulpit of that's seized by Louis Sullivan. Even though they decried the fact that he was lashing out against a particular brand, they were compelled to remove the brand from the test market. And this actually energized the advocates against this targeted marketing strategy. So in 2009, it's not that the tobacco's friends in the Black community had disappeared, but certainly the energy for a ban had grown in the wake of the banning of billboards. And public health advocates, when the menthol ban failed to be included in this legislation, but was moved over to FDA, public health advocates began to push aggressively, pointing out the disproportionate marketing of menthols in Black communities, the fact that menthols provoked deeper inhalation, this feeling of anesthetic coolness actually was deceptive. It produced lower rates of quitting, and it should have been banned in the first place, like other forms of illegitimate enticement. The industry's response is interesting. They argued that the majority of all menthol smokers are white, despite the fact that, because 30% of white smokers preferred menthols, and whites being a larger percentage of the US population, that they argued it was a legitimate preference, as if it was just something that was innate to African Americans. And what they also argued is that menthols do not change the inherent health risks of cigarette smoking. They acknowledged that menthols were unhealthy. I'm sorry, that the tobacco was unhealthy, but they argued that menthol didn't change anything. Let me end by making a couple of observations about where the book ends and how it is that we arrive at this rather eventful week in the history of menthol smoking. I've tried to give you a very quick overview of the history, the kind of crooked path through which menthol has wound its way through American consumer culture. And when I was writing the book in 2021, the menthol story connected for me with two other horrific events: the murder of George Floyd and the arrival of the coronavirus. And to me, it made it clear that I should end the book by talking about the long road to I Can't Breathe. That is to say, how the menthol markets were created and sustained over decades is part and parcel of a story of disproportionate health calamities inflicted on Black communities. The book is in part about the web that has kept menthol in place, and that web includes Black media and civil rights leaders. But menthol is also part of a long road of structured racial inequalities. So let me just explain what I mean by that. That in 2020, COVID was disproportionately affecting African Americans, ending many lives with the cry, "I can't breathe," because of how it decimates the lungs. Of course, we know that the cry, "I can't breathe," began in Staten Island in the murder of Eric Garner, and was also there at the scene of George Floyd's murder in May of 2020. And it struck me that the endpoint of smoking, the endpoint of this menthol campaign, also ends with emphysema, lung cancer, and cries of "I can't breathe." So the story converges. And they're all forms of disproportionate ailing, disproportionate racial inequalities and health inequalities among Black communities. A few days ago, I did an interview about a month ago that resulted in this piece in the LA Times, how big tobacco used George Floyd and Eric Garner to stoke fear among Black smokers. Because in recent years, the argument against the menthol cigarette ban has been advocated yet again by new civil rights leaders of our time. Like pictured here, Al Sharpton, where the LA Times points out that tobacco companies R.J. Reynolds, whose cigarette market is under threat from restrictions and bans on the sale of menthol cigarettes, has sponsored an organization led by Reverend Al Sharpton in its campaign against menthol cigarettes. And the argument here is often that to ban menthol cigarettes would be to create a Black market, a bootleg market that would put Black men in particular at increased risk for police surveillance if they were smoking cigarettes. But I argue that that story is wrong. That rather the menthol cigarette is part of the history of the systematic strangulation of African Americans, leading, like COVID and like police violence, to the problem, to the cry, "I can't breathe," crippling the ability of African Americans to breathe over different timescales. And sadly, the problem here is that these are not deaths that are caught on camera. They're not videotaped for all to see. They don't happen over minutes, like the murder of George Floyd. They don't happen over weeks or months, as in the story of the devastating impact of COVID. They happen quietly and secretly over decades. And the purpose of my book is to pull back the curtain and to reveal the actors, the different kinds of supporters that have been part of that systematic, slow strangulation, the targeting and the strangulation of African Americans that lead us to this particular moment, a moment that will come to culmination actually in the next, I would say, 48 hours. The question before us is the banning of the menthol cigarette. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wailoo, for really an outstanding talk. As you say, pulling back the curtain on all the sinister ways we've been manipulated, and really some of the also heroes in that story, like Dr. Sullivan. We're proud to call Dr. Sullivan's a local hero for us also. We're proud to call him a graduate of our internal medicine residency program, and he joined us this morning, in fact, for
Really?
rounds. Yes.
Wow. I wish I could have been there.
So thank you again. I invite everyone to type questions in the chat, but perhaps while people are doing that, I'll start with a question. In Push and Cool and in your talk, you really tell us a story of how regulation can lead to these consequences and really the cultivation of and exploitation of new markets. Do you have concerns about a menthol ban having a similar effect in the future?
So I would say that the challenge of is not regulation so much as what I would call uneven regulation. That is to say, the regulation on children's smoking in the 1950s was done without regard to what the industry would do next. Mm-hmm. And the industry pivoted aggressively into Black communities. The banning of television and radio ads was done without concern for how it would kind of energize point of sale advertising, Black themed advertising, and the use of Black publications. So it's not regulation per se that's problematic. It's anticipating what the industry will do in the wake of the of regulations. So I'm not concerned about the banning. I am concerned about banning cigarettes if it leads to things like policing of African Americans or policing of anyone. And so far, there is no evidence in local bans or in state bans that these are about banning kind of institutional sale of these products, right? So it's uneven regulation that I think is the focal point of concern. Now, the one thing that I am concerned about that the industry will do, you're already seeing evidence of this in the UK, which is that the technical term for what is being banned is menthol as a characterizing flavor. Now, what the industry is already doing in Europe is, even in the wake of bans on characterizing menthol, they are selling menthol cigarettes, but they're arguing that these are not characterizing flavors. They're looking for loopholes to allow them to continue selling menthols, but to argue that the menthol is so indistinct that it's not a characterizing feature of the cigarette. So those are the kinds of, implications of regulations that I'm watchful for. Because I do think that the industry has proven itself to be extraordinarily adept at figuring out new strategies for building markets.
And I guess we can get to some questions here. A related question from Kat: if menthol as a flavor is being challenged as being alluring to children, why is flavored alcohol not being considered, since there are more drinkers than smokers? And I guess we could also talk about e-cigarettes, similar conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a good question, although it's a question for a different speaker, right? Because I'm not giving a talk about, flavoring. The question is, we're talking about tobacco products. We're talking about tobacco products that have distinct negative implications for health. We're talking about tobacco products that have a long history of courting youth smokers. Menthols were often seen as great starter products. Flavored cigarettes were seen as starter products. And we're talking about, in some ways, fulfilling, continuing a story that began and really should have been brought to fruition in 2009, but wasn't. I can probably spend another talk talking about alcohol and flavoring. We could talk about soft drinks and flavoring. I mean, I'm not saying anything about Kat's question, but unfortunately, one of the strategies often used by the industry or those who are skeptical about these moves is the what about question, right? Like when tobacco products were linked to lung cancer, the industry was really leading the charge at saying, what about air pollution? And in some ways, they helped to generate air pollution science because they were trying to say, yeah, there are other reasons why people develop cancer. Why are you picking on us? The makers of Uptown tried the same thing to Louis Sullivan. Why are you picking on our product? there's so many other reasons why Black people are, having problems with health. Why pick on us? So while I agree that that's a legitimate argument, often it has been used by industry to distract whenever it seems like there is regulation that is imminent.
Another two related questions. Has there been any financial compensation for this racial marketing, or do you think there should be?
So the one thing that the industry did for a period of time when actually California passed a proposition that ended up, there's been funding for a lot of, as a result of the settlement, there's funding for the public service announcements that we have come to expect. So there's a way in which the only form of what you might call reparation on this has been a kind of acknowledgement that the industry needs to put effort into smoking cessation or warning people in a more honest way about the dangers of cigarette smoking. And this takes us to the e-cigarette, because there are two kinds of images of the electronic cigarette. One is the image of a device that is purely about nicotine and has nothing to do with tobacco, and that is characterized in its most positive form as a smoking cessation product, like a Nicorette gum or a nicotine patch. It's a way to get off of the more deadly thing, albeit by turning to an addictive drug, an addictive substance. In some ways, it echoes where the menthol cigarette started in its history. The idea that if your throat is parched or if your cigarette is making your throat feel bad, try a menthol, right? And so menthols, like e-cigarettes, came in with this kind of idea that we're better than what's out there. But the problem is that the e-cigarette has also been a lure. It's been a way of especially getting youth and underage people to start into a nicotine habit. And a lot of the industries argue that they're not doing that, right? That's just kids doing that. And right now, I think FDA isn't sure whether they believe that the e-cigarette can be the good version, as in the smoking cessation product, or whether it's really just another gateway to tobacco products in the longer run. And so I think that's why you have a different kind of politics of e-cigarettes, because there's some people who argue that, menthol in e-cigarettes, if you ban menthol cigarettes, then people who smoke menthols need a path out of their dependence on menthols. And the e-cigarette might be the next step before quitting. And that would be a more positive image of what the e-cigarette could be. I won't weigh in. I grapple with this in the conclusion to sort of point out why it is the politics of e-cigarettes are a little different.
Cole, do we have time for one more question, you think? Okay. Can you speak about tobacco industry support for minority cultural groups and other community organizations? I think you alluded to some of this.
Oh yeah, I mean, this has been one of the most surprising and disturbing features of the story. That is that the support for Black publications, for instance, like Ebony magazine, the support for the United Negro College Fund, the support for the NAACP fashion shows. I mean, you could just run the cool jazz festivals. And so, the industry really became part in some ways of Black culture in championing features of Black culture, but the goal is to not seem to be manipulative. So, and there are times during which the manipulation was obvious. I'll give you maybe two quick examples. Well, one was in 1965, when Nat King Cole, famous Black singer, widely, a mainstream musician, died from lung cancer. He was an avid smoker. His death was, his struggle with lung cancer was covered in Ebony magazine, but when he died, and they did a long story about his, path-breaking role as an entertainer, as a civil rights activist, they mentioned everything except his smoking. So it's as if he just developed lung cancer. And then in that same issue, there are 4 ads for menthol products. A few years later, one of the companies is trying to figure out new ways of branding a menthol ad that might have appeal for Black smokers. And one of them says, how about if we call a new brand Cole? Because it brings to mind people's memories of Nat King Cole. It's as if they, I think they didn't go anywhere because somebody pointed out that this guy died of lung cancer as a result of his smoking, and his wife had actually sued the industry and they had quietly settled. So those are, to me, the stories that highlight the way in which the Black civic institutions, which ordinarily under other circumstances like Reverend Sharpton, the NAACP, Ebony Magazine, are advocates for Black health, well-being, rights, and forward-looking progress on this topic, they have been quietly either silent or, up until recently, the NAACP was advocates for the industry, but then changed their tune, thankfully, so that now the NAACP is calling for a menthol ban. And that, to me, is a kind of sign of progress and change.
Well, thank you again on that note. I think we'll end. Thank you again from everyone here at the Weill Cornell community. We hope many of you can join us again tomorrow for the book club, and have a good evening.